Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alexandra Vacroux, the Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, and I am thrilled to be back in conversation with Fiona Hill, the Robert Bosch Senior Fellow at the Center for the United States and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Fiona served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019. But it wasn't her first stint in government. From 2006 to 2009, she was the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. She's the co-author with Cliff Gaddy of Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, and The Siberian Curse, How Communist Planners Left Russia Out in the Cold. And she has an MA in Soviet Studies from Harvard's very own Davis Center and a PhD in History from Harvard, where she was a Frank Knox Fellow. She also has a master's degree in Russian and modern history from St. Andrews University in Scotland, which I mentioned because it's a very important part of her book, which we are here to discuss today. Fiona's latest book is There Is Nothing for You Here. I'm a little disappointed, Fiona, that you didn't have the word pet after that, which I gather was how your father had originally mentioned the phrase. But what's very interesting about this book to me is that it's a deeply personal account of where you came from, how you got here, and the similarities between post-Thatcher Britain, Russia under Putin, and America in the age of Trump. So I'm very much looking forward to talking about all of those things today.
Well, thank you very much, Alexandra. And of course, another important part of my biography is that you and I were at Harvard together. In fact, we started at the same time.
1989, an excellent time to study
Russia. You were in the government department, and we did, I think we did Tim Colton's first class when he was a professor at Harvard, and that was his first year as a professor together.
That's right.
So I remember it very well. As if it was yesterday.
So I want to start actually with a period a little bit before then. We called this talk The Improbable Fiona Hill because it's amazing when you read your biography, how you came from a poor working class background and made it to Harvard and then made it into, let's call it, the American political establishment. And you attribute your success to education and educational opportunities. And a lot of that was about hard work, but a lot of it was also good fortune and good luck. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the balance between hard work and good luck and being in the right place at the right time. How those things came together to get you where you are.
Well, look, I think that the timing and the good luck part of it was pretty important, because you can work your tail off. You can work as hard as you possibly can and then not get the break, right? I mean, this happens to so many people in so many different contexts. And, you and I just mentioned we got to Harvard together in 1989, and it was still the Soviet Union. And while we were there in those early classes, the Berlin Wall came down. In fact, I remember I was sitting in a class about the Berlin Wall, the history of the Berlin Wall and the Berlin airlift, being taught by the very famous Harvard professor, Stanley Hoffman. And I don't know if you were in that class as well, but he was very late. We're all wondering what had happened to him, looking at our watches, because there was a 15-minute rule. If the professor didn't show up in 15 minutes, you could all go and have a drink at the pub or have a hot chocolate at the cafe, whatever you wanted to do, but you were free. And then suddenly he swept in. He was wearing this big kind of thick felt coat that he wore and a big hat. So he was quite dramatic looking. He swept in, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Berlin Wall has fallen." We were like, whoa. That kind of put a different perspective on the class that we were studying, about the whole emergence of the Cold War. So timing was really critical here. I basically decided to study Russian in 1983, 1984. And it was against the backdrop of the war scares, of the stationing of missiles in Europe, the Euromissile war scare that, you and I later studied from an academic, point of view. But things were basically happening in real time. And so my area of studies was really very much shaped by the fact that suddenly history was happening all the way around, and we were right in the middle of events, and we were studying it in that period. But if I go back into just my personal experience, yes, working very hard at school, being encouraged into education by my family, but also educational opportunities were opening up in that very time frame that hadn't been there previously. And in fact, some of them disappeared for my sister, who was only 2 years behind me. So I really had all the luck, I felt. I basically was the last in my cohort or a sort of generation really to take an exam called the 11 plus, which was being phased out. And this in the UK used to determine whether kids would go on an academic track or a track that was more in the direction of vocational work. You might end up becoming a teacher or a nurse, but the whole idea was you wouldn't be going off to university and you wouldn't go off into one of the professions. And it was really a kind of a determinant of who you were going to be in your life. You were going to be, you know, perhaps in a profession, a lawyer, a doctor, you know, kind of a politician, academician, you know, something like this. And this 11 plus exam, when you talk about a rigid selection process, it was either, you know, it wasn't just pass fail, it was just how well you did. For working class kids, 1 or 2 kids from a school would get plucked out after the 11 plus if they'd done really well and sent to a grammar school, either a boys' grammar school or a girls' grammar school. And they would have everything paid for, a whole kind of completely free education, and that would put them off on this life track. Now, I came along and the 11 plus and grammar schools were being phased out, but I was the last group of kids to take the 11 plus. And I did really well at it. And although there was no grammar school left in my hometown, and I went to what was then this new kind of broader comprehensive school that had tracking, you know, streaming, a bit like the regular American public schools, there was still this kind of feeling that the kids who'd done really well in the 11 plus were owed something. And I'd actually been offered a place at a private school, an all-girls school, with a very good reputation that was in, you know, in Durham, the bigger town city near where I grew up. But my parents couldn't even afford me to take that on, even though there were fees were going to be waived, because I'd still have had to pay for uniforms and books and school equipment. My parents had no money. And so we didn't take it. And I think there was kind of still, though, in the system, this idea was like, this kid did really well. You know, she aced the 11 plus, we should help her out. And so all the way along in my early education, I keep getting this assistance. And so by the time, I mean, obviously I applied for a lot of grants and scholarships, but people would tell me about them. Oh, you're a bright girl, you did well in 11 plus. Here, let me tell you about this. Or there's this fellowship, or there's that scholarship. And so I would, you know, try hard and take a risk and apply for them. But the lucky thing was that they were still there, these opportunities. And if we kind of fast forward, you know, the people who are the young Alexandra and Fionas of, you know, today, those kind of opportunities aren't really there. Yes, you know, kind of education is available, but you have to take on loans. It's much rarer and far more difficult now to apply for grants and subsidies or to find these fellowships that are still around. So and I don't know whether that was the same for you, Alexandra, I graduated from everything, you know, high school, obviously, but college, university, and then graduate school with no educational debt. And I think of that as lucky, but also about timing. And then that was never then an impediment for me going onwards with my, you know, career, or, you know, I could actually take a bit more risks because I didn't have this huge educational debt hanging over me. But I'd had a lot of people investing in my success. And, you know, I was aware of that right from the very beginning.
So despite your successes, you arrive at Harvard, and you mention, actually you talk about it in St. Andrews also, this idea of imposter syndrome, right? I don't belong here. Everyone is smarter than me. Like, I'm an accident. It's something that's usually reinforced by some of the other students as well. And I think people who don't know Harvard don't realize the extent to which that is a widespread feeling. In fact, at Harvard, they offer these seminars on imposter syndrome, and every year they offer it, they need a bigger and bigger auditorium for it because everyone shows up. And I was wondering, you know, how you dealt with that and overcame it, and also what advice you might give to people who are in settings where they have young people, women, people of color coming in and possibly not feeling comfortable or feeling that they belong there. What can we do in order to make that less of an issue?
Well, that's great that there's actually a seminar for this now, because it wasn't when you and I showed up.
Yeah.
But I did find, you know, I talk in the book about St. Andrews, where, you know, it was really rare for any kids in the, you know, 1980s to go to university, actually, in the UK. Only 5 or 6% of people leaving school went on to university. So that wasn't just all, you know, Ivy League equivalents, Oxbridge and, you know, St. Andrews, where I went to, Durham, these kind of places. it was just, writ large. So the idea of that higher education was already a rarity. So, there were, because it was such a tiny little pathway there, I think, something like imposter syndrome was inevitable. And as most of the students who were going to university came from private schools or grammar schools, somebody had gone to a comprehensive school like I had, which were fairly new, but were really picking up from, the old bifurcated system. And many of the comprehensive schools were what were secondary modern vocational schools and didn't have, very good academic track records. People just found it was just, how the heck did you get here? And I started to worry quite a lot about the fact that I'd had all of this assistance, mostly monetary, but, sometimes about extra tuition and, people really wanting to help me out, that, God, well, maybe I didn't really deserve it, kind of, I obviously wasn't as clever as all of these other people. I'd had this extra, hand up or lift up. And of course I'd worked really hard, but I'd also knew there was so many things I just didn't know. And I had all these experiences along the way, just reinforcing that I didn't know lots of things. So I'd spent my entire time in the library. And I had some extracurricular activities, but a lot of it was just going to the library, picking up every book I could find, reading everything, taking furious notes in class. But one of the things was I went to talk to the professors because, many of them were pretty friendly. I mean, a lot of them very different background to me, but I also was one of those kids who I did want to ask for help because I knew I needed it. And I think, for many people, just getting over that hurdle of going to talk to your professors, the lecturers, the staff at the university, and kind of really, reaching out yourself to learn more. I always tell my daughter who's in high school, go talk to the teacher. Don't just dial a friend, or we couldn't do that back in the day, or talk to your friends, exactly, text a friend. Kind of just go and ask the teacher and ask them to explain things. And when I came to Harvard, I was really lucky that I found, a lot of the faculty members, some of them, we talked about Tim Colton, whose class we were in together, they just started themselves. They had imposter syndrome too. Some of them were very eager to talk to us because they felt the same way. But there was also lots of, professors from overseas at Harvard. So a lot of people were, because it was such a rich environment, a lot of people who turned out were in the same boat. And so I felt right away that, you've managed to pluck up the courage to go and ask, some of the faculty, to explain things more. They were actually quite open to it. So I would always say to people, ask for help. And as you said, you find out pretty quickly that everybody else, with a few distinct people who don't have it, also has imposter syndrome.
We're actually getting quite a few comments in the chat, not only from alums, but also from people who were in the program with you at the same time, who are saying that they felt the same way as well.
Exactly. You kind of found out there was more of these social events, and you kind of hesitate, and you suddenly find that they felt the same way. And I have to say that I really appreciated Americans' openness about this, because with Brits you would never know it if they at the time if they had imposter syndrome, because you were just supposed to suppress it all and act super confident as if you kind of knew what was going on. And
right.
Most of the time, kind of, I certainly didn't. And so I really kind of found that very endearing when I got the that people would confess the same thing. I really like that openness in an American society that wasn't there in the UK.
So that creates another problem, which one of our more recent alums has put forward. He's also from a working class background. And one of the issues he has now is when he goes back to his hometown, he gets into conversation with neighbors about what he does for a living. And he's an analyst in a think tank. And he finds that having intelligent and sort of informed conversations in this post-truth environment, when expertise is no longer respected, becomes more and more difficult. And so his question is, what advice would you have for rising regional experts who are concerned about pursuing careers in public service or civic education in a world that increasingly rejects their knowledge and expertise as a public good?
Well, I would say stay at it. And I think, part of it is making that personal connection. I mean, I'm sure that, whoever asked the question had the same feeling as I did. I mean, I kind of, coming from a working class background, my family, were not highly educated. My dad had been a coal miner and then became a hospital porter. Everything that he had learned, he taught himself. And, my mother was a nurse, so she actually, had a pretty skilled job. And, but obviously in a, very different environment. they were always pursuing knowledge. And, perhaps that's part of our problem now, is that, people don't pursue knowledge in the same way. At least they think they're pursuing it by looking up to something on the internet and circulating information around rather than going out there and reading books or getting trained. But I always felt back in that environment, back in the day, that we were, kind of, education was sort of being, not that it was withheld, but was somewhere beyond our reach. And that, things were done to you, at your expense, because you weren't fully participating in the larger politics or the larger kind of social environment. I think that's actually part of the problem why people are so drawn to conspiracy theories in this post-truth environment now, that they feel like they're left out of something. So there must be something kind of going on that they don't know about. And then they get kind of drawn into a conspiracy, think, aha, I had this feeling, all the way along that somehow I was being excluded. I kind of went on a slightly different path in this. I thought, well, I've got to learn as much as everybody else. I've got to try to figure this out. If you want to have your voice heard, and people in my family were like, how do you make your voice heard? How do you try to influence things? Other people joined the local union, the miners' union, or the National Health Service unions, or they were involved in the community. I kind of felt then, well, the larger politics was affecting us. So how could I learn more about this to figure out, kind of whether we could do anything about it? And, the irony, of course, is now, years and years and years later, I've figured, kind of that out. But then the difficulty is, how do you go back to where you came from? It's a bit like being in The Hobbit or something, how do you go back to the Shire? Say, well, I've been out in this crazy world out there, and all of these things happened. And people are going, yeah, right. So how do you bring it back? And I do think it's actually by telling stories, telling personal stories. It's one of the reasons I decided to write the book like this. It's not that I was kind of born and suddenly fully formed as a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, right? And I mean, you and I know, because we've known each other a very long time, that we've gone along progressions to get to where we are now. But then how do you figure out how to go back to make that connection? And then you have to open yourself up and, explain where you've come from, and, the kind of the perspectives that you've had there, and try to make that connection real, so that then people can understand, kind of the larger picture that you're proposing as well. I mean, I've had a hard time for years trying to sort of explain to people why I see things the way that I do, because I've just come from a different vantage point. And so, in the book, I decided to kind of lay it out, why I see and how I see connections between things that other, people might not see as relevant. And so I would say to kind of analysts, anybody who wants to be that, do all your homework, work hard, as we always do, but try to make a connection back to the audience, to who it is that you're trying to get the information across with. And again, I think, Americans are pretty good at that, telling, a story, telling your story, opening up to why you think, the way that you do, and try to make that connection with people, because we are in a very, very difficult environment right now. And, I'm starting to kind of think of it, perhaps, the only way that we can really bridge that is to give a little bit more of ourselves in this than we would have done previously. Try to make a connection with people so that they can at least see where you're coming from, even if they don't initially trust you.
So one of the things that struck me is the way that your background informed how you understood Russia in the 1990s. So you were there, you were working on a Harvard project, and I was struck by how sensitive you were to what the working class was going through. So many of us were working on privatization or economic reform and all of these, some might argue, misguided ways of helping Russia in the transition. But it sounds like the fact that you had come from a deindustrialized working class background deeply affected the way you saw what was happening in Russia in the 1990s. Could you talk about that a little bit?
It did, because I had this instant shock of recognition. I felt like, what's happening here was very similar to what had happened to me back at home and what had happened to my family and friends and my region. And I'd first noticed the similarities when I'd gone as an undergraduate on a year abroad, a study year abroad, in 1987, 1988. I mean, like many other people, I'd been drawn to Russia, from national security or culture or, kind of history, politics issues, just about place, just so utterly fascinating, or the Soviet Union, in that time frame. And I'd really been motivated to study Russian against the backdrop of the war scares of the 1980s that you'll remember as well. Kind of the whole SS-20 Pershing missile, Euro missile crisis from 1977 to 1987, which shaped my entire, teenage and years and early times at university. But I'd also, when I arrived in Moscow in 1987, was really kind of struck early on by how similar Moscow was to my home area, even though this is like a giant, huge, city, an amazing kind of cultural center. But of course, it's the Soviet Union is the country of workers and peasants, and I was a worker and a peasant. On one side of my family were farmers, on my mother's side, and on everybody else was a worker in a factory, a shipyard, a coal mine, steelworks, you name it. And of course, all the kids that I'm at the institute with in Moscow, although it's the Translators Institute, some of them might be the communist elite, but a lot of them are like me. The kids who've got, the upward mobility, maybe because their family joined the Communist Party, but they're training to be interpreters at the Maurice Thorez Institute of Foreign Language and Linguists. But a lot of them are just like one step away from the factory. They're living in a communal apartment with their family on the outer edges of Moscow, and they've kind of come in, and education and languages, like for me, is their pathway. And then it was glasnost, perestroika, the kind of the height of the Gorbachev period, and things are opening up. So I get invited out to their family villages, where the family had kind of just come in from one generation before into the city, and it's just the same. I mean, where I grew up in the north of England, there weren't a lot of people with cars. It wasn't because they weren't being manufactured, it's just because nobody could afford them. And I saw an awful lot of people, going around horse and cart, and, just like in the Russian villages. My grandparents hadn't had running water until well into the 70s, had outdoor toilets. I was just like, yep, this is, I see this. This is my life experience. And so in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and, shock therapy was underway, and with all the Harvard projects, and the technical assistance, I was immediately struck by what was happening to people like me. How they were losing their sense of identity. The workplaces were crumbling. They might still be on the books of whatever factory it was, but they weren't getting paid. The pensioners and the pension arrears was the most painful for me to watch, because my grandparents had been essentially abandoned in a mining village. It's only 8 miles away from my hometown, but they were in one of these, long rows of houses where the rest of it had all been boarded up, and they had nowhere to go. Our house was too small to take them in. We didn't have any money either, and all the services stopped to the village. The bus didn't go in anymore. My grandparents were in ill health; they couldn't leave the house, and it was really just very stressful trying to help them out. And here in Moscow, this big city with all these resources, there are all these old people on the streets. I mean, you remember that, begging, particularly old ladies, had gone through World War II and, you name it, and all these stresses and strains, and then suddenly they had nothing. Their pensions weren't being paid. And they were in the same dire straits as my grandparents, but they might not have any family members to look out for them. And when I travel out into the furthest reaches, on, the various projects that we were doing there, and see, old people abandoned thousands of miles away from Moscow, hundreds of miles away from Moscow, sometimes just even a few kilometers away from Moscow in these villages, with nothing. I mean, it was just heartbreaking. And I started to really think a lot about, that dislocation, that post-industrial dislocation, what was really happening, to the workers, and, which was pretty much the majority of the population. So I had a very different view. And that's, and at Harvard, when I started to pick courses from both my master's and my, history degree, I started looking much more at kind of political economy, social and economic history. And eventually, when I got to the Brookings Institution, I started working with Clifford Gaddy, my colleague who was an economist. And he'd been a Labour economist, and he was also an economist of looking at the Soviet era defense sector, and the big manufacturing sectors. And we started working together on this book, the first book on the Siberian curse, about communist planning and building of all these big industrial Siberian cities. Because for me, this was kind of, in a way, a mirror image of what had happened in the UK, of the building up of nationalized industry after World War II, and getting all these people in places when the whole economy unraveled that they were trapped in. So the image of my grandparents trapped in this village that was only 8 miles away from my hometown, I transferred onto people who were, thousands of kilometers away in these Siberian cities. So it really shaped my my whole outlook on what was happening in the transition in the former Soviet Union.
And when did you get the sense, maybe this Washington consensus idea isn't going to work in Russia any better than Thatcher's system worked in the UK, at least as far as kind of my people, the working class, are concerned?
Pretty much right away, but I didn't feel like I had the tools to say anything. I mean, I wasn't an economist, I was a historian, and I kind of thought this isn't going to work. And one of the things that really struck with me, I write about this in the book, was a class, and I don't know if you took this as well, that I'd taken with Janusz Kornai, very early on. And Janusz Kornai, unfortunately, just passed away last week in his 90s. I mean, just a really wonderful man. And he had written, a book on the shortage economy, the whole, deficits and the breakdown of central planning. And obviously, as a Hungarian economist, he was very much focused on how Hungary could make the transition from a state plan to a capitalist free market economy. And he'd written this book, The Road to a Free Economy, which I think he'd just finished just as we arrived and we were taking his class, and we'd read extracts of it. And I was really struck by, his observations that we needed a social fund to think about how you helped the workers from the state-planned economies, because he was just talking about Hungary, but it could have been extrapolated to everywhere else. And this is, 90, 91, to move, help them move, in other words, to get new skills, to retrain, and to just get the larger information and knowledge about how you kind of think about being in a free market economy as opposed to a state economy. And I was thinking about all of this, and first of all, I didn't quite understand some of the things he was saying, and I went in to talk to him again, this piece of advice, and he gave me like an hour and a half, almost like 2 hours of this whole discussion with him, because I was having a hard time making this leap, from my own personal experience into, the kind of more abstract, terms that he was using. But he brought everything right back. And I realized, after this hour and a half, that I had lived in the same economy in the north of England. My dad was no different, as a coal mine, then working for the National Health Service, from, one of the workers in a state-planned, setting in Hungary, Poland, or still then the Soviet Union, and having to kind of make that leap to a whole new economy. Because once privatization was underway in the 1980s in the UK, it was the same massive dislocation. And my dad had never got any chance to retrain. There was no social fund. That came later for people of a different generation. And so, when I got to Moscow, I realized that people like my father were going to be completely left behind. We're going to be millions of them, not just hundreds of thousands as there had been in the northeast of England, but millions of people who were going to be left out of this move to a new economy. And there wasn't really that thinking about social funding in the sense of having them retrain, requalify, and helping them to make that transition. I mean, we sort of had ideas of this through some of the technical assistance projects, but it wasn't sufficiently to scale. And so that with people being left behind and that dislocation, we're going to get a lot of grievances. And the one thing that, I regret in the book that Cliff and I wrote in The Siberian Curse, we didn't get to the political aspects of it. We kind of ran out of grant money. the curse of every, which is the Siberian curse, but the curse of every academic. We didn't have enough money to do that next bit.
So as you said, like, there were a lot of grievances piling up in the 1990s. And that's one of the things that Putin was able to kind of parlay into his popularity. He promised stability, he promised prosperity. At least for a while, he was able to deliver on the prosperity part. But now we find ourselves 20 years in, potentially up to 36 years in to Putin's rule. And, there's a lot of questioning among academics and policy people in Washington right now about what we should be doing about Russia. So I think there's a pragmatic line that says dialogue is always productive. Even if you don't like somebody, it's still better to understand what they're thinking and for them to understand what you're thinking. And then there's another group of people who think that dialogue is the same as appeasement, that basically, we should be sidelining Russia, cutting them off, isolating them. And I was wondering where you stand on that and what you think we should be doing in terms of having a coherent and intelligent Russia policy as the United States?
Yeah, look, whenever I hear that, you know, actually you've got to kind of cut them off and can't speak to them, I keep thinking, well, why aren't we doing that with China? You know, and we have a similar problem right now of a huge inordinate scale with China as another competitive system. You look at what the Chinese are doing with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, what's happening in Tibet, the pressure on Taiwan. You know, it's inescapable that we have similar magnitudes of problems. And if people say, oh, well, you know, the Russians are doing this, that, and the other, well, the Russians, you know, kind of exfiltration of data pales in comparison with what China has done, theft of intellectual property, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think, you know, people would recommend us going on hellbent on a confrontational path with China. You know, maybe part of the push on Russia is because people think we can afford to do that. You know, I think you and I and many others know that there are some certain dangers on trying to put Russia off. This has been attempted at different points, and the Russians have a way of reminding us that they're there. And we've seen, you know, many of the ways in which they've done this. That, of course, doesn't mean to say that you can't deal with and shouldn't deal with many of the problems that are posed by the style of Russia's interactions with us right now. I mean, I've written a piece that was just extracted from the book and then adapted for Foreign Affairs recently, you know, kind of talking about how, you know, very sadly there's been quite rather a convergence between, you know, kind of us and the Russians in the sense that, you know, we kind of hoped, and, you know, you and I were in Moscow at the same time, that the rule of law would really take root, that, you know, the pluralism and democratic experiment that we saw in the 1990s would continue, that there would be, you know, there has been a turnaround in the Russian economy, actually. And, you know, you said, I mean, if Putin wasn't just clinging on to power or staying in power, he's not really clinging, but, you know, kind of making sure that he can stay in power, and definitely we might have a different assessment of, you know, the terms of his presidency there, with putting Russia back into solvency, you know, strengthening the state to some degree again, you know, putting Russia back on, you know, kind of its global international footing. But of course, we'd have a big question about the methods that he's used to achieve that. And, you know, if we start to, you know, really look at the, you know, the ways that, in which Russia has infiltrated our society, it's done it through all of the kind of portals that they've done in places like Georgia or Armenia or, you know, Ukraine. It's been through politicians, you know, obviously hacking into our internet and other vulnerable systems, but exploiting divisions within society to pit people against each other. All of the kinds of things that we've seen, you know, Russian security services do in the kind of the neighborhood, and also at home against their own, you know, domestic opposition, we've seen them start to, you know, to do here as well. So, you know, we've become extraordinarily vulnerable. And then the question is, of course, why is Russia doing that? And as I laid out in that recent Foreign Affairs piece, Putin wants to stay in power, or at least if he doesn't want to stay in power, he wants to make sure that he can enjoy whatever retirement he wants to go into. And people like Alexei Navalny have given us a bit of an insight into what that might be, with Alexei Navalny's amazing video, which I think you were the first person who pointed me to that. Alexandra, you'd watched it really early on as soon as it released, and I think you sent me a clip and said, you've got to watch this, which is really astounding video that Navalny released after he'd gone back to Russia after the assassination attempt that he'd survived, showing, you know, Putin's palace down in Zhendlik on the Black Sea, complete with the casino, the vineyard, the private wine thing, the ice rink, the little church, and the pole dancing, you know, kind of whatever that venue is, what one would call it, God knows. Anyway, you know, we see that Putin wants to make sure that whether he wants to stay in power, he wants to have, you know, a more leisurely retirement, he wants to be, it has to be on his terms. And so, you know, justifying the assassination of people like Boris Nemtsov, the attempted assassination of Alexei Navalny, and these opposition, it has to kind of basically fit into this idea that many people around Putin saying there is no Russia without Putin. What's Putin? It's not just the person who put the country back on its feet again, but the person who is protecting the country from an adversary. Who's that adversary? It's us. It's not going to be China, because the Russians certainly don't want to contemplate that, but it has to be a worthy adversary, right? It can't be Estonia or Georgia that they've had at various points. It's got to be, you know, if the United States didn't exist, they'd have to invent us. And so, you know, they spend an awful lot of time creating a picture of the United States as constantly after them, constantly having, you know, Putin and Russia in the crosshairs, even though, you know, for a large part, ever since, really George H.W. Bush and the attempt to kind of manage the chaos of the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've wanted to put the relationship on a different footing. I mean, our other colleague, Angela Stent, another graduate of Harvard, has written all these books about the limits of partnership and the ups and downs. And every time we've attempted to just kind of move this along, we don't want to still be in this confrontation, but that it keeps on coming back. And of course, the more that, they try to get our attention and to hit at us, the more that we have to react, because we can't possibly, just acquiesce in all of this and let it all happen. So we get back as how do we have a sensible policy? I think, unfortunately, if we are looking out to Putin being in place till at least 2036, or certainly into wanting to, keep the population, everybody mobilized around the idea of a threat and him being in place, we're going to have to keep dealing with the fact that they're going to keep on trying to provoke us into, some kind of managed confrontation. We want to manage the confrontation away, they want confrontation and just to kind of keep on managing it. So we can't take our eye off the ball. The Russian ball hit us with it. But we have to kind of figure out, like, really, I mean, do we really have to do this? So we have to kind of bear in mind that they do make this all about us, but we have other things that we're wanting to do. And we have to kind of figure out then, we don't have the luxury of cutting them off and ignoring them. We've been there, done that and tried that. We have to kind of manage this, as you say, in a sort of sensible way without appeasing them in any way and opening the door to, more atrocities. We have to then figure out how to blunt that. And it has to be done in conjunction with our allies and of us kind of calling things out. And most importantly, shoring up our own vulnerabilities, which gets us back to our own domestic politics. Because what the Russians did in 2016 was exploit things. They didn't invent things. They exploited things when they intervened in our election. And I've been trying, both in that book and in other ways I've been speaking out, to highlight that to people. Domestic and foreign policy are now intertwined. For Putin, they're intertwined because it's all about him staying in power. But for us, they're intertwined too, because our domestic partisan infighting, the polarization, all of the divisions in our society make us unbelievably vulnerable. They've become a national security crisis. We can't have collective action to push back and, to move forward, but we're also opening ourselves up to all kinds of exploitation.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think what you're saying is that there are two aspects of having a Russia policy. One is how we deal with Russia and Putin directly. And the other is how we protect ourselves from our own vulnerabilities. And that's completely on us. The cyber weaknesses, the political polarization, the divisions in the US, social media platforms, all of that is actually on us and has very little to do with Russia when we're thinking about it. And I think it's a mistake that those two are often conflated. There are a few more questions coming in from Russia. I want to pose them to you before we move on to the White House. So one is, how do you think that Russia's demographic situation is playing into Putin's calculations and the way that the country sees itself over the next 20 years? Is there a concern, I assume, by the aging of the population and the shrinking of the population, that something has to be done that might affect either domestic policy or foreign policy?
Well, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? I mean, kind of, we all sort of think that a large population is, somehow more beneficial because we've always been thinking about this as sort of exponential growth. But, a larger population, particularly when you think of a world now that, what have we got, 7.9 billion? The population bearing load of the planet, I think we're kind of now starting to see is well and truly surpassed. I remember, my history classes looking at Malthus, Thomas Malthus. In fact, I think we even had him come into one of our political science classes we did together. Everyone was like, oh, stupid old Thomas Malthus, kind of, he was completely wrong, kind of the world was always managing to accommodate. Well, you know what, he might have just been, how many, 200, 300 years a bit early? Because, now we're seeing with climate change and, kind of all of the, crises that we're having in the agricultural sector as a result, there are many places in the world that are becoming unlivable. The emigration that we're getting from Latin South America, particularly Guatemala and Honduras, people have been devastated by drought and hurricanes. All the way around the world now, we're seeing the kind of capacity for the old breadbaskets of the world, Iraq, kind of Syria, Afghanistan, all kind of places that have been, wrapped by war, North Africa, they're all having all climate disasters as well. And, here in the United States, we're having plenty of problems with hurricanes and flooding and drought and fires and everything else as well. So, there's that aspect, for Russia, that actually having, kind of a larger population might not necessarily be beneficial, over the longer term. So I think the question is really the quality of your population. What I mean by that is health. That's part of demographics as well, and mortality rates. The pandemic is really hitting Russia hard now. I mean, this, is kind of massively problematic. Highest infectivity and mortality rates. It's also your population cohort, right? I mean, the way in which it is imbalanced. If you've got more of an aging population, particularly an aging population in ill health, then that's a problem. And then it's also the quality of education and training. So I think, demographics is not just about the number of people that you have, but, kind of, is your human capital well invested in? And, at one point in 1900, Russia had the fastest growing population in the world. Later on, fast forward to the 1990s, the fastest shrinking population in the world because of dislocation. Mm-hmm. And we've had a lot of brain drain from Russia as well for political reasons, not just sort of socioeconomic earlier on, but now political reasons. So I think, the big question for Russia is, can it invest in the quality of its population in terms of their life expectancy, their health, all these things related, and their education and training? That's the question for all of us, including for the United States. Having 1.4 billion people as China has might seem, a great opportunity for growth and, for stimulating your economy. But, kind of, it may not overall, if 1.4 billion are under risk from, drought, flooding, ill health, and, become a burden over time. Also, Chinese population cohorts have got skewed too from the one child policy. So I think, demography is a complex thing. And, here in the United States too, we're grappling with demographic change. We're grappling with higher mortality rates. We're looking at the way that the pandemic has hit different populations. So I think, we need to pay more attention to that. But a shrinking population isn't necessarily, basically a black mark on the future.
So one of the questions here is from the audience is, do you think that the COVID situation, which is indeed peaking right now, it's far worse now than it was last summer, for example, do you think that there's a risk of political instability in Russia?
Well, there could well be. I mean, look, we're seeing it here, right? I mean, we've got polarization on the basis of COVID, and it is definitely contributing to political polarization. Mm-hmm. And I've been reading, rather a lot of articles, as I'm sure others have right now. I'm talking to a few friends on the phone who are in Moscow, including Russian friends. And, it's clear to me that, the Russian government has a problem on its hands because people don't trust the government. And, all the propaganda has come back to bite on, talking down Western vaccinations in favor of Sputnik, but also contributing to the anti-vax movement. Now, we've got plenty of anti-vaxxers our own in the West, but, there's definitely been a lot of fueling of those fires. And, it's like a boomerang. It's come, right back again. If you only got, 30 to 35% of the population vaccinated, that's a real problem. I mean, in the United States, we've got this on political cleavages. I was just looking at some of the charts, and something like, is it like 80 to 90% of people who describe themselves as Democrats are vaccinated, as opposed to 40-ish, 50% of Republicans? Well, this is Russians are not dividing themselves up onto these political alliances. These are just, Russians, of all kind of political persuasions. That is a real problem. It's showing an incredible distrust in the government. Because the government, while it's got propaganda on the externally about the vaccines, internally is trying to have a vaccination drive. And so political problems, if you're seeing a lot of protests in Russia, apathy, distrust of the government, I mean, that's not a great recipe for the future. So absolutely, I mean, it depends on how you define your political problems. It may be become very difficult for Putin over the longer term.
And of course, one of the problems is that, what if you put in a vaccine mandate and people still don't get vaccinated, right? That's not very good. If you're kind of a strongman type of leader, and you can't get people to get vaccinated, that actually ends up making you.
I think he's got himself caught, because it's hard to tell French and Brits and Germans and Americans not to get vaccinated, through your propaganda outlets, and try to get Russians to get vaccinated, because it's more porous now. I mean, I know they're taking steps to try to close down the internet and access to stuff, but you can't do that overnight. And Russians are traveling. Russians have got a lot more contacts with people, in spite of many of the efforts to restrict this over time. And when they the fact that people are on planes to Egypt or wherever for vacations when they've been taking vacation days for the vaccines just proves that it's very, very difficult to manage this now. I mean, really what we need to do is get over all of this anti-vax propaganda with collective action, same with climate change issues, and have collective action and get rid of the vaccine nationalism and do what we did in the past. I mean, we tackled smallpox together, we tackled polio together, we've been tackling highly drug-resistant tuberculosis together. We need to get our act together here. This is one area where I really wish we could find a way of working with the Russians in a concrete fashion, because I do think that the Sputnik vaccine has a role to play. It clearly seems to be more effective than the Chinese vaccine. And in conjunction with now this effort to get the Sputnik manufacturers and AstraZeneca to be working together, we need to be doing something here.
So one of the problems in dealing with the whole COVID pandemic is, of course, that the United States has not been a leader, or at least was not a leader under Trump in terms of its reaction. And that leads me to ask some difficult questions about your work in the Trump administration. I gather from the book that it was pretty excruciating to be, watching on the inside and seeing that the dysfunction was just as bad as what we were seeing on the outside. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what made you go into the administration and why you stayed. I know you had a lot of people telling you that you shouldn't, and you decided to do it anyway. And if you could just talk a little bit about what your calculations were there.
Well, my calculations were based on, in part, the fact that I'd already been in the government before, National Intelligence Officer, so I knew a lot about, what was going on, and a lot of the people who were still in government. I'd been there through two administrations, the Bush administration and the Obama administration, obviously in a non-political, non-partisan, very professional position. An awful lot, as I said, a lot of people that I'd worked with then were in government, and some were going to come back to try to deal with the aftermath of the 2016 interference in the elections. And, I was talking to people, around that. And I was deeply worried about what had happened. Because, before 2016, we'd had a lot of concerns already about the confrontational path that we were on with Russia. And I certainly, for one, wanted to try to head off as much as I could any kind of literal blow up in the relationship, and try to see if we could mitigate what had happened and try to make sure that it wouldn't happen again. I wasn't fully cognizant, I think, of the depth of the problems domestically in the US. I mean, I was very much at that point nationally security focused. I thought that, behind the scenes, given all the people I knew who were going to be there, it would be possible to get a lot of things done. And I have to say it was possible to get a lot of things done. Just to be very clear, the dysfunction was very focused, and then it spread out, I should say, over time, to be much more diffuse than it had been. But I really kind of felt that if we pulled together with us, very much a team effort, that it would be possible to do something. And to try to also engage with Russians and say, what are you doing here? Kind of, where is all of this headed? Because I was, still very much in contact with people who I'd been in government before. I didn't have access to classified information, but knowing about all these real concerns that people had about where this was headed. And people might remember, General Breedlove, when he stepped down from being SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe for NATO, worrying very much that we might end up in some kind of low-level nuclear confrontation with the Russians. People cast their minds back. There were all kinds of worries and concerns about a local conflict getting out of hand. And, this is obviously, annexation of Crimea, all the kind of the war talk. We had a lot going on. And I felt like, look, I've spent my entire professional life working on this. If I don't step up at this moment, because I have this, rather unexpected request to go in, what am I going to do? Just sit in the sidelines and spitball and, not try to do something? It's like the house is on fire. People saying, here, come and join the bucket line, or, come and help us rescue something. So I thought, well, okay. I mean, I didn't think I was going to be doing it on my own. I mean, then, of course, when I got in there, and as I lay this out in the book, I was very quickly disabused of any possibility of being able to prevail on President Trump himself on, the seriousness of the situation. He had totally different perspective, from all of this. But it was, really possible to work with others. The National Security Advisor I was working for directly, first McMaster and then Bolton. And I also gave myself deliberately a shorter time frame. I was not going to stay in there for the whole first term. And I did that really on the basis of a lot of consultation with colleagues, but also thinking about these dark warnings that I'd got from people who said, don't do this. Some said I'd never speak to you again. And I was like, okay, I get it, but it was worth, I felt really, I wasn't going to get my head turned by all of this. I wanted to get in there and try to do something. And I thought this 2-year term was reasonable. And then I worried that then the campaign would start, the political campaign, for the next election. Well, it turned out that never really stopped. And by 2019, it was well in full, well in full motion. And that's when, all the real difficult decisions started to be made. But, right from the very beginning, it was a maelstrom. I found myself in the middle of just this totally chaotic, totally crazy. And I, describe in the book a bit like Alice in Wonderland, alternate universe. I'd gone through the looking glass, down the rabbit hole, the whole thing, in a way that I was not expecting. American domestic politics was 1990s Russia on steroids.
So one of the things that that's been interesting to me is I think back to the 1990s when Americans, young and not so young, went to Russia ostensibly.
Yeah, you and I were there at the same time on different projects. Yep, seeing it all. Yep.
To help out. And, we were pretty convinced that American institutions were so great and so strong that other people should have institutions just like ours, right? Look, 200 years, no big problems. Obviously,
this is just a civil war, a civil rights movement.
Apart from that, but we've kind of figured it out, right? And then it turns out that the institutions are much weaker than we anticipated. I think of all of the things we were telling the Russians about, Congress, about the presidency, about checks and balances, the judiciary, the independent judiciary. And it seems like what we saw under the Trump administration, and it's reinforced by your book, is that in fact our institutions were incredibly fragile and they were entirely dependent on the people in those positions, in particular. Right, that they have to observe the norms, right? And if you have a president that doesn't observe the norms, in fact, the whole system can fall apart very quickly.
Correct. I mean, flawed leadership, no one's immune to it. And our institutions got well and truly stress tested. Mm-hmm. And, we saw all that happening in 1990s in Russia, right? I mean, Yeltsin had a very different sensibility to Putin. So if somebody comes in and has a different mindset and wants to use the constitution or institutions in a different way, and they get enough people to go along with them, then they can. And, there were still, of course, a lot of people in our institutions, Department of Justice and the Pentagon and the, uniformed military, in the national security apparatus, the State Department, et cetera, who did stick to their oaths to the Constitution and to their senses of their jobs and their sort of shared mission of public service to the country. But there were also a lot of people who didn't. Mm-hmm. I think what shocked me the most is the deterioration of the party system in the United States. And here we were back to the 1990s. I was working, with the Strengthening Democratic Institutions project at the Kennedy School, and we were trying to help Russia set up political parties. Mm-hmm. And, we worried after that we'd been strengthening autocratic institutions because an awful lot of the Russian political parties, including, what became United Russia, parties of power, took away, from trips to Iowa and New Hampshire, something very different from what we thought that we were getting across to them, which was the grassroots, kind of democracy. They took away all this about how political party machines operated. Mm-hmm. And later political action committees and all the ways that you could manipulate an electorate. And, in fact, that's where our political parties have gone in the United States. And, our parties are big. They're not kind of, I wouldn't say big tent, but they've got all kinds of factions, they're kind of warring with themselves, but there's, huge, big money in politics with the political action committees, super PACs. Remember, Putin was very dismissive about democracy. It said it's who shouts the loudest and who pays the most. And there's rather a lot of elements of that in our political party system with the super PACs and big money coming in, particularly from our equivalent of oligarchs, billionaires, and, stop some legislation in its tracks from their payments to, various the parties and individual congressmen and senators for their races. And we have a lot of people, performance artists. I mean, I many times looked at Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I don't know in person, and I think Vladimir Zhirinovsky, and kind of the LDPR candidates. And I always remember one very cynical Russian political party operative saying to me, the difference with us and you is that your fanatics believe in what they do. Our fanatics are just playing, because Zhirinovsky was always just kind of playing games. And one might think that some of the political performance artists of today are playing games, but it also seems that they believe in what they're saying and what they're doing here in the US. So you can really see that dysfunction. I remember, Putin also said that his experience of the 1990s, watching the Duma, the fisticuffs, all the kind of things breaking out, the uncivil discourse. I mean, he was obviously watching some of it from the sidelines up in St. Petersburg, and as a KGB guy, FSB, he was probably pretty cynical anyway. But he just kind of thought, who needs democracy? And, an awful lot of people today watching everything going on in our political parties are thinking the same thing. You see this coming up in political opinion polls. The people don't see the political parties representing them. And so Trump, comes in from a total wildcard candidate. He's not part of the Republican Party. He doesn't, share any of the real ethos and, ideology. He doesn't even know the history of the party. Half the time when you hear him talking about the political figures, you have no idea who they are and what they did. And he's, the one left standing out of the kind of reality TV show of the primaries with 17 candidates. It's like, kind of a beauty contest or The Bachelor or Survivor. And, kind of he's the one that emerges from it all. And, he takes the party hostage. And, we see the similar sort of things unfolding in Russia as well, but also in the UK. Nigel Farage, who took, the United Kingdom towards Brexit, was never in Parliament. He never had a governing role. He has had the most significant impact in the UK history in generations. But he forced the Conservative Party and other parties to take on his agenda or, try to oppose his agenda. We've just sort of seen these kinds of things sort of playing out in different political settings, whether the degeneration of political parties, but also people feeling that those parties don't really speak to them anymore, that they don't represent enough of their interests.
So what can we do, Fiona? What can we do in order to make the political system more responsive to both the populations and, I would argue, to those who have expertise that's needed to solve some of these big problems?
It sounds like Lenin, doesn't it? Those those kind of pamphlets from back in the day. No, I kind of think
it's an appropriate last question.
So right? Weird, isn't it? Isn't it just? But I think we have to get people to be more politically engaged without being partisan, which means, we have to start to, think about how we mobilize ourselves to, really sort of take action to try to fix things a bit closer to home. So in the book, I kind of end the book, I suppose in a slightly weird way, but about what you can do not to create opportunity, but it's really to participate in our democracy. But it's, how do you give people a stake? Opportunity is about having a stake in society. It's not just the opportunity to get an education or to get a job. It's an opportunity to feel that you're actually contributing something or that you're participating in something larger that is having benefit to you. And I think there's lots of things that we can do within our communities, our neighborhoods, getting engaged in a university context, through student groups, getting engaged with schools, volunteering, public service, state and local government. I mean, I still hope that people would contemplate breaking into the federal government service as well, although, obviously looks daunting, but, we have a harder time recruiting people for federal government service, even though more people are retiring now. I would definitely encourage people to think about going into government, being an analyst, kind of going into joining the State Department. I mean, we need younger people to step up, but we also need people to write to their Congress people and say, excuse me, we're still in a representative democracy. Could you actually try to represent me? It's not just the people who voted for you, but me, I'm your constituent as well. I mean, some places it's easier. I mean, I, kind of feel as somewhere like in Maryland, where I live right now, there's this pretty civil discourse. We actually have, a Republican governor, and we have, Democratic senators and Congress people, and they actually all seem to, get on, kind of reasonably well. So how can we strive to that? I mean, Massachusetts is somewhere where there's lots of interesting politics happening. It's amazing the number of people from Harvard who are running to be governor or mayor right now. So obviously people have been thinking about how they can be politically engaged. So I think that's it. Go out there and be engaged. You don't have to be partisan, and kind of figure out something that you can do. and basically have a demonstration effect, get people to kind of be working together. And I'm thinking of all this as a challenge to myself as well. I do think our domestic politics right now is a massive national security crisis. We don't have the collective action to do anything, frankly, at the moment. And people are still looking to the United States for leadership. So if we can fix ourselves and find ways of fixing ourselves, it's going to be all hands on deck. It's not just who's the guy in the White House, although obviously I would prefer one particular guy not to come back. So obviously, because of just the sort of dysfunction that I've seen. But how can we, really move forward ourselves to put ourselves back in the action as well? And I'm trying to think about that too. And it doesn't mean running for Congress. It's just what can we do, around us to work with like-minded, doesn't have to be, again, politically partisan, but like-minded people to get some sort of change and to push forward. Election monitoring, making sure that people can get out there and vote, for example, all different kind of ways in which we can participate.
I think that's a perfect way to end, Fiona, with the idea that we all have a role to play. There's something that each of us can do. Your book at the end, actually, I kind of like that checklist, because you say, if you're a teacher, you can do this. If you're a student, you can do that. And I think that really makes it much more real. You don't have to be president in order to affect big changes, or even to affect, the way that we think about Russia. So thank you so much, Fiona, for writing the book, for being here, for mentoring our students and students elsewhere. It really makes an enormous difference, and we're very grateful.
No, well, I'm really grateful too, Alexandra. I mean, it's great being here with you, but I wouldn't be doing any of these things without Harvard and the programs and all the Harvard grants. And, so I'm also eternally grateful, and I want to pay it back and pay it forward. So, I'm in it with everyone else as well.
We're glad to hear it. Thank you very much to everybody that's been watching. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but I'm sure we'll have Fiona back and we'll be able to continue the conversation. Thank you.